Well, we've arrived at the end of Joshua. Joshua's kind of interesting because it really has like two endings. There's an ending in chapter 23, and then there's a second ending in chapter 24. So we'll take a look at both of them. They both take the same form. They are both a kind of farewell address on the part of Joshua as he prepares to die. And what Joshua says actually is interestingly similar to Moses' farewell speech in Deuteronomy 31. I may make a couple of references back to it just to kind of help us on that point. But we just want to pay attention, right? Because when someone makes a kind of farewell speech, right, our antenna should go up, and that we should be aware, right, that something really important is being said. So we'll try and pay attention to that. So we've come now to the end of Joshua's career. Just as at the end of Deuteronomy, we come to the end of Moses' career, and Joshua wants to kind of offer some final words to the people. So we'll start and take a look at chapter 23, then probably next Sunday we'll get to chapter 24. So here's part of what happens in Joshua 23. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and its head, its judges and officers, and said to them. So now Joshua is addressing the whole people, in effect, gathered together. Almost a kind of Mount Sinai moment here. I am now old and well advanced in years, and you have seen that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you an inheritance for your tribes, those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off from the Jordan to the great sea, that is the Mediterranean Sea, in the west. The Lord your God will put them back before you, will push them back before you, and will drive them out of your sight. And you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with those nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by or serve them or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. So a number of important themes there. One of the parallels between what Joshua says and what Moses says at the end of Deuteronomy is this emphasis on cleaving to the law or to Torah, this cleaving to the law that's been given on Mount Sinai. And I just want to say a word about that because I know it's easy to kind of misunderstand this. The importance of cleaving to the law or living by it really is twofold. One element is, right, that keeping the law is Israel's way of responding to what God's done for her. Okay, it's not like you don't keep the law to like earn God's favor because you actually got God's favor before you like did anything. So that's an important point. So living into the law, living into its provisions, its moral provisions, its social provisions, its religious provisions, these are all ways that Israel responds to God's call to her and becomes his people. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is that it's precisely by responding to the law, right, that Israel is actually formed so as to be able to stand apart from what's around them. Okay? Notice the really important point here, right? If you take the people of Israel and just sort of like, settle them down in the midst of some kind of pagan culture, some Canaanite culture or whatever, right? And then say, okay, you guys, your job is to worship God and be really good. You're on your own. Goodbye. We all know what's going to happen, right? So this word isn't used, but I think one way to think about law here, and one of one of the ways to interpret what Joshua is saying is that Israel's living into the law is her form of discipleship, right? This is what forms and shapes a people who are able to kind of stand apart from what's around them. It's a resource for doing that. There are other resources too, but Joshua here is emphasizing the law. And notice how he puts it. I think this is really significant. He says, therefore you shall be very strong to keep and do all that's written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, and that you may not mix with the nations remaining among you, but you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. So the idea here, right, is that, and this is important too, the keeping of the law is a form of loyalty. Okay? I think one way to kind of think about this, because this, our context is very different. One of the things we may want to think about is this. The thing that we kind of recognize or know today as the Apostles' Creed was referred to in the early church, not as a creed, but as the symbolon, S-Y-M-B-O-L-O-N. What on earth is that? What's this? The symbolon was the oath of loyalty that a soldier took to the emperor upon entering the Roman army. The church's point, right, is that when you say the Apostles' Creed, you're not just kind of running off a laundry list of things or ideas, right? Rather, it's a vow of loyalty. So just as Israel lives out her loyalty to God through keeping the law, the church then gets this creed, right, that it lives out its vow of loyalty too. So loyalty and faithfulness here are central to what's going on. Now, another thing that Joshua says here, I think that it's really important, is in verse 11 of chapter 23. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them so that you associate with them, and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall become a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish off this good ground that the Lord has given you. So, two things that we just want to kind of notice there. Notice here, once again, that Joshua associates the keeping of the law with the love of God. Now, I know that to us, that sounds a little odd, right? We think of law and love as being like opposites. We just want to remember, like, in the Bible, they're not. Okay? In modern American culture, they are, but in the Bible, they're not, in this sense. Love here, both in its Old Testament form and also later on in its New Testament form, love is not an emotion. It's not just like a feeling. It's sort of more something along the lines of a sort of intentional act of the whole person. Okay? So here's a good example. I've got one example from a form of worship, and I've got another example from the Gospel of John. I hope this will make the point. So think about the marriage liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer. Got a man and woman standing up there at the altar. They're facing one another, and we're now having them affirm their wedding vows to one another, right? And I say, to the man, for example, do take Sally here to your wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, richer or poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until you are parted by death. Is that what you're intending to do? There's usually kind of a little pause. But notice this. Notice that at no point in that promise is this man being asked to feel anything. He's being asked to do something. Okay? Love, cherish, having to hold, better for worse, richer for poor, no matter what happens, until one of you dies. That's kind of the deal. And it's the same thing here, right? That is, love here isn't simply an emotion or a feeling, but it's an intention that's acted out. Okay, so that's the worship example. I think maybe a really good example too comes in the Gospel of John. This is John 14:21. It's actually one of several examples I think that could be used, but I think this is helpful. So here's one of the things Jesus says to the disciples. This is obviously being now spoken on the last night that he's with them, right? So remember in chapter 13, he started to wash their feet. In chapter 14, 15, and 16, he's going to kind of give them a final instruction. So here's part of what he says in chapter 14. This is 14:21. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. Notice here that the keeping of the commandment and love are seen as sort of like synonymous in a sense, right? You display your love by keeping the commandment, and hopefully the motive for keeping the commandment is love, right? You're not just saying, okay, well, we got to do it because Jesus said so. That's why. No, hopefully, right, what we're seeing the keeping of the commandment is motivated by love, but it's also an expression of love. So we have the two things connected. I think that's what Joshua is getting at. The second point is this, and I think this is important too. Notice that Joshua says, well, if you break the command, if you break the covenant, okay, if you basically sort of like devolve back into a kind of Canaanite, pagan form of life, if you begin worshiping the Canaanite gods and therefore begin living like the Canaanites, right? Then you'll have to reckon with the fact that I'm going to send disaster on you. That A, I won't drive out the Canaanites before you, and they'll hang around like they are now and be like a constant source of difficulty and problems to you. And that in effect they will become to you, thorns. The image almost here is like, think about like a really powerful dust storm that's blowing like bits of sand, little bits of wood, maybe thistles and thorns. It's all being like blown at you, right? You feel the sting of it like all over your body, right? That's the imagery. Now, the question is, well, why is this? So once again, I think it's really important to say something like this, right? That this is typically what we would refer to as like God's wrath, right? This is Israel's experience of God's wrath as a result of her unfaithfulness. Now, we always have to be careful with the word wrath, because when we talk about God's wrath, we don't mean that God's like gone into like a momentary like temper tantrum, right? That God has like anger management issues or something like that. Wrath is the divine love experienced in the mode of opposition. That is, when Israel breaks the covenant, right? Does that mean that God sort of like ceases to love his people? Well, no. But what he does do, right, is he works to correct them, to kind of like bring them back. In effect, right, it's a way of allowing the consequences of their unfaithfulness to kind of like pile up on them. And so wrath here is the divine love experienced in the mode of opposing it, resisting it. Not allowing it. I mean, ultimately, right, one of the things that we're seeing here, and is one of the reasons why the book of Joshua is so significant, is that we see that there's a sense in which sin makes no sense whatsoever. I hope everyone's kind of like realized this by now, right? Sin makes no sense whatsoever in this sense, right? God's told his people, I brought you out of slavery. I brought you into this land. And my intention is to bless you. And when you break the covenant, right, what you're saying is, no, we don't want to be blessed. We want to kind of like have things our own way. We don't really want to be blessed. We want to kind of get what we want on our own. And that's why I say sin makes no sense, right? Sin is our active resistance against God blessing us. And that's why it makes no sense, right? It's like, the story about the man who was, sitting on the limb of a tree. And there were a couple people, on another limb on the opposite side of the tree that were kind of like saying bad things about him. And so he decides to get rid of them. And what he decides to do, right, is he pulls out a saw and begins sawing his limb. Believing, right, that once his limb is sawed off, they're going away. Well, they are going away in a sense, but not in the sense that he anticipates. Okay, so that's part of what's going on here. So we just want to remember, right, that there are consequences to breaking the covenant. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this is not just because it's like an interesting Old Testament topic, right? But obviously, this makes its way into the New as well. One of the things that all the New Testament writers are really concerned with is they see the human state of sin as the consequence, right, of our broken covenant with God and the consequences of that. So now something has to happen, right, to remove those covenant curses. And that's part of what the cross is about, right? It's about removing that. So that's something for later on, but we just want to notice that it's present here. Now, a couple more things about Joshua 23 that we just want to note. This is what Joshua says in 23:14. And now I am about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed, but just as all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down before them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you will perish quickly off the good land he has given to you. So once again, there's that idea, right, of God's wrath or anger as that which, is the divine love experienced in the mode of resistance. One final thing that we just want to note here. I think one of the most interesting Psalms in the Old Testament is Psalm 136. I'm going to read part of it to you. We don't have time to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read part of it to you because I think it makes an important point. Psalm 136, like a number of psalms, is a psalm which kind of offers a kind of an encapsulated history of Israel. And in doing that, it does something else that's really important. So it's really important to recognize, right, that the purpose of recounting history in the Old Testament is not to just provide people with like interesting facts, but rather the purpose of recounting history is to keep the people mindful of what it is that God's done and how they've come to this moment. Okay, so 136 does this in a really powerful way. I'm just going to read the first couple of verses and I think you'll get a sense of what's going on. So Psalm 136, verse 1. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who alone does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever. To whom by understanding is made the heaven, who made the heavens, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who made the great lights, and his steadfast love endures forever. The sun to rule over the day, for his steadfast love endures forever. The moon and the stars to rule over the night, for his steadfast love endures forever. And then it begins with a recounting of the history of Israel, basically from the Exodus, kind of onward. And then the psalm concludes like this: give thanks to the God of heaven, for his steadfast love endures forever. So notice what's going on there. Notice that Psalm 136 was actually relatively brief, right? It's doing something really important. First, it's encapsulating the whole history of Israel in the context of God's action. Okay, so it begins with creation, and it ends where the psalm stops that day. But that ends with God too. And then God's everywhere in between as well, right? With that repeated refrain, for his steadfast love endures forever. And I think that word, steadfast love, is really important. It's actually one word in Hebrew, and we don't really have like an adequate, English translation. And so translators have to struggle with it. But the point, is, that the thing that emerges in the history of Israel, and Joshua's reminding them of this, the thing that emerges in the history of Israel, is the steadfast, enduring, sort of unchangeable love of God for his covenant people. That doesn't change, right? Later on, in the letter to the Romans, Paul's going to have to deal with apparently the thought of some, that God has sort of in effect, canceled his former covenant people and hired new employees, right? And Paul's reaction to that idea is one of total horror. For a number of reasons, but one reason certainly, if God makes covenants and then almost capriciously goes back on them, there's no gospel. It's gone. Paul's whole gospel depends on the faithfulness of God, right? So it's really important to emphasize that faithfulness. One final thing about Joshua 23, and that's this. We just want to note something once again about the figure of Joshua. I've said a couple times, that it's clear that Joshua can be understood as a prefiguration of Christ, if for another reason they have the same name, essentially. And I think the question here, is what conclusions can we draw from Joshua about the qualifications or character of a Messiah? Okay, so I think we can draw a couple conclusions. One is, and it's one we drew at the end of the last time we met, just before Palm Sunday, and that is Joshua's humility. Remember we saw how Joshua had kind of parceled out the land and didn't parcel out any for himself. And it's kind of only when God tells him, hey, Joshua, you need land too. You better give yourself some, that it actually happens. So one of the things that's going to be required of a Messiah is that kind of level of humility. Another thing we see here, is notice that at the very center of Joshua's farewell speech is this exhortation about the Torah. One of the fundamental tasks, if not the fundamental task of a Messiah, is going to be to instill faithfulness in the covenant people, and to allow that to sort of be the focus. I mean, obviously, we could imagine Joshua's speech playing out in some very different ways, Joshua could get up and he could sort of talk about, all the crises that he faced and all the times the people of Israel doubted him and, all the nights that he stayed up worrying about stuff and, da-da-da-da. He could go on and on and on about all that. Interesting, We don't hear a word of that in this speech, and we won't hear a word about it in the next one either. Whatever Joshua has endured and whatever he suffered, and it's obviously been a lot, we don't hear a single word about it. What we do hear is Joshua's exhortation for the people to live into Torah. And what we also hear is Joshua reminding the people of what God's done on their behalf. That's what we hear. And obviously that's then part of the Messiah's job description, right? We see this already in the person of Joshua. Now, just one little note on 24. I'll just say one thing and then we'll stop because we're almost out of time, but I want to kind of keep us going. So, ending number 2 in 24, once again, addressed by Joshua. This time, things are a little different in a couple senses. One sense right off the bat is this. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders and the heads and the judges and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. So remember, Shechem, the city of Shechem, is where the tabernacle is, the dwelling place of God. And so in 24, that's where Joshua summons the people of Israel. In effect, right, whatever they're going to say, and he's going to like force them to make a promise. They're literally going to be making the promise they're going to make to God because he's like right over there. Okay, so this is intentional on Joshua's part, okay? So the other thing that's going to be really important to watch here is, once again, notice that this is a genuine covenant. And that means, right, that it's going to involve everyone. Joshua, the elders, heads of families, judges, officers of Israel, everyone. But covenant here involves everybody saying yes. It's not like, well, you know, we're going to elect Joshua. He's going to be our representative, and he'll talk for us. And if he gets something wrong, we'll blame it on him, or something like that. No, covenant here requires not only collective responsibility, but individual responsibility as well. And I think the really important thing to say here is those two things cannot be separated out. We can't pull those two things apart. Communal responsibility, individual responsibility go together. And Joshua's going to really emphasize that. And that'll lead into next time. We'll pick it up somewhere around Joshua 24:2, because Joshua then goes back and then offers another encapsulated version of Israel's history. Although this one's different. So maybe he was just a good teacher and realized, you have to kind of shape things up a bit to get people to remember stuff or something like that. But he's going to offer a slightly different recounting of the history of Israel. And it's going to involve something really interesting. We'll talk about this next Sunday. As you read that encapsulated version, there's one really important event that's missing. And it's kind of hard to understand why. Because the thing that Joshua leaves out of the second recounting is there's no mention of the covenant on Mount Sinai. So next week, we'll try and think about why that's the case. I mean, I don't think that Joshua had a senior moment. And, he said he was old and forgetful and, it's not that. There's actually a reason, but we'll take a look at that. And we'll finish the book of Joshua next Sunday. I want to add to that just a kind of concluding reflection of some of the things I think Joshua can teach us. And then we'll go on to the book of Judges. And we'll start by talking about Supreme Court judges, and then we'll talk about appellate judges and all other judges after that. So it should be really, really interesting.